Now, let's talk about how things get absorbed. It's important to understand why this works. Why nanoemulsions? Why do they improve the bioavailability? Why is it faster when you do it that way? And why specifically that size? Because if you understand why that size, then lots of questions go away. What's a good nanoemulsion? Well, this will tell you how to tell a good one from a bad one, right? So if you consume an edible, or if you consume something that has oil or fat, it arrives in your small intestine. After it passes through the stomach, nothing gets absorbed in the stomach. Alcohol does a little bit, but it's kind of an exception. Oils don't. So it gets through your small intestine, through your stomach, into the small intestine. It arrives as kind of like a blob, a drop of oil. And that drop is not water-soluble, right, because it's oil. It can't get through the water to the inner wall of the small intestine. And it has to do that because for a number of reasons that mainly have to do with defenses of your body, the inner surface of your small intestine is lined with something called unstirred aqueous layer. It's basically a mucus layer that's mostly water that is not really moving, and in order to get to the other side of that and get absorbed, you have to be water compatible. Otherwise, you're just not getting there, right? So oil can't do it. It just kind of sits there. Now, in order to bring that oil in, you have lipases and bile salts and phospholipids that are locally generated. They come and start digesting this oil. By digesting, well, when you digest the triglyceride, you clip the glycerin group off and you release the fatty acids. And so you take these fatty acids, release them with lipases, and they self-assemble into something called mixed micelles. Mixed micelles are basically oil droplets. They get phospholipids and bile salts, which are surfactants, biologically generated surfactants. Those end up on the surface, and so now you have these mixed micelle nanodroplets, about 10 to 30 nanometers in size, depending on what's inside. And if you have cannabinoids, those can't get digested because lipases only work on triglycerides. They don't work on other oil-compatible things. But cannabinoids will simply find their way into the interior of these droplets. So now you have a very similar situation to what I showed you before. You have this droplet. It has surfactant on the outside. It's about 10 to 30 nanometers in size. It has oil on the inside, and inside that oil there's your bioactive. Cannabinoids or coenzyme Q10 or who knows, vitamin D, right? Anything that's oil-soluble. Now these can now travel through water because they're small. Now the inside of your small intestine has a structure. It's called villi. So they're kind of protrusion, like finger-like protrusions lining the surface. Now these villi are composed of enterocyte cells. Those are the absorption cells. That's how things go into your bloodstream, through those cells, or into the lymphatic fluid. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but you could go into the blood or you can go to the lymphatic fluid. These enterocyte cells have microvilli on top of them. So that's these pink things you see there. Those are about 100 nanometers in diameter, and the space between them is 100 nanometers. So in order to get absorbed, you have to fit in between them. That's how you go in as a droplet, right? Now, if your droplet is bigger than 100 nanometers, it just won't fit. It can still probably get absorbed, but the efficiency is lower. So when the droplets are well below that, that's when the absorption really gets intensified. And that's why nanoemulsion droplets should be around 20, 30, 40 nanometers or so, because they fit properly. And importantly, this thing takes a long time. So to make these mixed micelles, it takes about an hour for this process to even get going properly. After about an hour and a half, you have enough of them. Now they can travel, and then they get absorbed. So after maybe a couple hours, this process is really going. And after 3 hours or 4 hours, it gets up to its maximum. And that's why edibles do what they do. You consume an edible, there's nothing for an hour. Then maybe you think you didn't take enough. Maybe you think you need to take a second one. A couple hours later, you learn that it was a big mistake that you took the second one because it was just a delay, but it doesn't mean that it's... So then both doses hit you, and then you're in space somewhere. The beauty of nanoemulsions is that these little droplets, you can just consume them directly. That's what you're doing when you're consuming a nanoemulsion-based beverage. You're consuming a suspension of pre-digested droplets that were simply digested with a proper technology outside of your body. And you don't have to wait for an hour and a half for this thing to happen on its own in your body. That's why the peak is not smeared, the absorption peak is not delayed, the bioavailability is high, because otherwise, by the time this thing is formed, it's in competition with the normal elimination process. That's why if you don't go in, then you go out, right? But the faster it is, the higher the peak intensity, the greater the bioavailability, and also the more predictable it is. The more prescribable, therefore, it is.